Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have Jean-Paul Sartre, author of Nausea and Being in Nothingness, versus Albert Camus, author of The Stranger and The Fall. This one begins with two major philosophers and writers of the mid-20th century sharing much in common, including a warm yet very competitive and even critical friendship, but dissolving their friendship as a result of the politics of the post-war period. In discussing their feud, we'll get some insight into their divergent philosophies of existentialism and the absurd, but by the end, we'll see two great minds of the 20th century losing their friendship on the question of how best to advocate for justice and freedom in a meaningless world. The two meet for the first time in Paris, 1943, at the opening of Sartre's play, The Flies. Camus, a French Algerian stranded in Nazi-occupied Paris during World War II, walks right up to Sartre and Sartre's partner, Simone de Beauvoir, a brilliant philosopher in her own right. Camus extends his hand and says simply, "I'm Camus." That's a pretty baller introduction, by the way, hitting him with just the last name. That's like James Bond stuff. While it was their first time meeting face-to-face, they'd known of each other for years. In the leading up to this day, their work was often favorably compared to the other. They had even written reviews of each other's work, which makes a ton of sense. Both writers were intensely interested in existentialism and the absurd, or the conflict between an irrational, meaningless universe and the innate human desire for meaning. An outside perspective, they are incredibly similar thinkers and writers, but going back in their history with each other's work reveals some notable differences. Years prior to meeting in person, Camus had reviewed Sartre's novel Nausea, a story about a man who gradually comes to realize the absurdity lurking behind quotidian life, finding it increasingly, nauseating. For the most part, Camus had high praise for his contemporary writing. This is the first novel from a writer from whom everything may be expected, so natural a suppleness in staying on the far boundaries of conscious thought. But Camus has his criticisms as well. Namely, Camus characterizes Sartre as a philosopher first and a writer second, meaning that the visceral quality of narrative in Nausea is lost to some theorizing at moments, writing that Sartre's, quote, remarkable fictional gifts and the play of the toughest and most lucid mind are at the same time both lavished and squandered. Then, in 1942, a year before they're going to meet in person, Sartre is introduced to Camus' work, and he writes an essay about both Camus' recently released novel, The Stranger, and his philosophy of the absurd found in The Myth of Sisyphus. Like Camus had with his own work, Sartre finds much to praise. He endorses the work's central argument. Quote, "The absurd resides neither in man nor in the world if you consider each separately. But since man's dominant characteristic is being in the world, the absurd is, in the end, an inseparable part of the human condition. Thus, the absurd is not, to begin with, the object of a mere idea. It is revealed to us in a doleful illumination." However, it seems Sartre remembered Camus' criticism of his writing, that criticism that Sartre's philosophy at times overshadows his fictional prowess. Because Sartre says that while Camus' fiction is quite good, his philosophy is another matter. He writes, quote, "Camus shows off a bit by quoting passages from Jaspers, Heidegger, and Kierkegaard, whom, by the way, he does not always seem to have quite understood." Sartre may have also been motivated to take down Camus' use of philosophy because Camus, his only reference to Sartre in The Myth of Sisyphus is a very oblique reference in which he writes, quote, "This nausea, as a writer of today calls it, is also the absurd." So by not naming Sartre directly and only referencing him so sparingly, Sartre may have seen Camus as essentially placing Sartre below those other philosophers in terms of importance, which almost certainly bothered him, especially if he believed Camus saw him primarily as a philosopher more than a writer. Beyond these criticisms of each other's work, their philosophy of the absurd is different from each other's slightly, which we actually see peeking through some of that criticism of each other. So, broadly speaking, for Sartre, human experience builds meaning from nothingness, whereas for Camus, absurdity or meaninglessness is insurmountable in human experience. But this back and forth isn't really their feud. This is more an example of who they were as people. Both loved philosophy enough that they would critique a peer for what others may have seen as very minor sins. Indeed, they probably enjoyed, to some extent, this volley of critique insofar as it sharpened their crafts, because after meeting in 1943, the two became very fast friends. Sartre even wanted Camus to star as the lead in his new play, No Exit. Their literary bromance was very prominent in newspapers of the time in Paris. After all, we have two of the most radical philosophers of their time whose descriptions of this intellectually and morally bankrupt post-war Europe really spoke to the souls of the people. The two were gallivanting around Paris, exchanging exciting new ideas and challenging each other just the same. While they may have shared some quibbles with each other's articulation of the absurd and existentialism, they agreed on a world without purpose, a world without value. They agreed that in this world, man is condemned to be free. Condemned because without any universal meaning or value, man has the imperative to live and act authentically without transcendent instruction. For this reason, they were both rigidly committed to fighting injustice and the exploitation of mankind, especially the injustices faced by the working class or the proletariat. The two saw the working class as constantly dehumanized by being shackled to their labor value. And to reverse this, a new political system was needed. They agreed on that. In 1951, Camus published The Rebel, which offers a glimpse into his political system, which is a sort of moderate socialism. He outlines a philosophy of revolt that begins with the understanding that every human is free, but freedom is relative, meaning it's not absolute. In fact, Camus is just totally against absolutes, which he calls anti-human. Instead of the absolute revolutionary violence to achieve what he calls absolute freedom, he embraces instead moderation, calculated risks to avoid further reproducing injustice in the form of absolutism. Quote, "Absolute freedom is the right of the strongest to dominate. Absolute justice is achieved by the suppression of all contradiction. Therefore, it destroys freedom." In other words, absolute justice and absolute freedom are mutually exclusive. Sartre disagreed. He found The Rebel to be a dangerous and disgusting text because in his mind, perfect and absolute justice and perfect and absolute freedom could go hand in hand. In fact, he'd say it was already being done in the Soviet Union in the form of communism. By returning autonomy to the worker can live without want and therefore choose how to best live for themselves, therefore achieving a sort of self-actualizing freedom. So absolutely free and absolutely just. Camus was equally disgusted with Sartre's political views as Sartre was with Camus'. Camus pointed at what was happening in the USSR and said it was not free or just. To establish communism not only required revolutionary violence to overthrow those over the working class, but that revolutionary violence led to a new absolutism, which led to new injustice. In the case of the Soviet Union, Camus was mortified by the stories coming out of there about the gulags and show trials. Their falling out over this disagreement was incredibly public, playing out in the French newspapers that would go on to sell out several times over, probably because in the feud between Camus and Sartre, the public saw two of the most prominent thinkers battling on a question faced by many leftists of the time. Do you embrace a moderate sort of path forward in the form of socialism in pursuit of freedom, or do you embrace communism in the hopes of absolute freedom and absolute justice? It was such an acrid disagreement that the two would never repair their friendship. In part because in 1960, at the age of 44, Camus passed away in a car crash. Sartre penned for his ex-friend a nice but measured eulogy, though in a letter to a friend after the fact, Sartre said he had been too nice in his eulogy. Quote, "There is a little falsehood in the obituary I wrote about Camus. He wasn't a boy who was made for all that he tried to do. He should have been a little crook from Algiers, a very funny one who might have managed to write a few books, but mostly remain a crook." So I guess if we're left with anything here, it's the question of absolutism in the domains of freedom and justice. What's the feasible price to be paid for justice, for freedom? Can absolute freedom and absolute justice coexist in any kind of tangible political system, or in a meaningless and irrational universe? Are we merely condemned to be free in a world that offers, at best, half measures and compromises? And as always, if you enjoyed this video or the work I do on this channel, please consider ordering my novel Her New Eyes and leaving a review. That really helps me out a ton.